November 13, 1965. The Tra Bong Valley, South Vietnam. A United States Marine Corps UH-34 helicopter is hovering 5 feet above a rice paddy. It is taking heavy machine gun fire. The fuselage is being chewed apart by rounds from the tree line. Inside the cockpit, warning lights are flashing. On the ground, in the deep mud below, 2 men are isolated. One is dying, his chest shattered by automatic fire. The other is unhurt. The pilot screams for the healthy man to jump. It is the only way out. The enemy is closing in, less than 100 meters away. To stay is suicide. To leave is survival. But the soldier in the mud does not jump. He looks at the pilot. He looks at his dying friend. And then, he waves the helicopter away. He pulls the pins on 2 grenades, stands over his mate, and prepares to die rather than leave him alone. To understand why a man would choose certain death over survival, you have to understand where he was forged. Kevin Arthur Wheatley was not built in a classroom. He was built in the brickyards of Surrey Hills, Sydney. In the late 1930s and 40s, Surrey Hills was a hard, working-class neighborhood, and Wheatley was a product of its pavement. Before he ever put on a uniform, he worked as a brick burner and machine operator. It was brutal, physical labor, handling rough clay, heavy loads, and searing heat. It gave him a physical strength that was disproportionate to his 5'9" frame. He was stocky, dense with muscle, and he moved with a peculiar, surging intensity. He didn't just walk, he charged. When he played rugby, or when he moved across a parade ground, he leaned forward, leading with his chest, his legs pumping like pistons. That walk earned him a nickname that would follow him into the history books. They called him Dasher. In 1957, at the age of 20, Dasher Wheatley enlisted in the Australian Regular Army. He didn't join for the ceremony. He joined for the work. He was posted to the 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, 3 RAR, and cut his teeth in the Malayan emergency. Malaya was the laboratory of jungle warfare. It was where Australian infantrymen learned to track, to patrol in silence, and to live for weeks in the rotting humidity of the canopy. By the time the Vietnam War began to heat up, Wheatley was no longer a brick burner. He was a Warrant Officer Class 2, a hardened jungle fighter who knew exactly how quiet you had to be to survive in the trees. But Wheatley was a complicated soldier. To the officers he respected, he was the best subordinate they ever had. To the ones he didn't, he was a nightmare. He was a rough diamond, a man who viewed dress regulations as optional suggestions, and who famously hated saluting. There are stories of Wheatley checking the perimeter wire just to avoid having to salute a passing officer. He was a drinker, a brawler, and a man who spoke his mind with zero filter. He was the quintessential digger, tough, irreverent, and fiercely loyal to the men beside him. On March 16, 1965, Warrant Officer Wheatley arrived in South Vietnam. He wasn't there to serve in an Australian infantry platoon. He was assigned to the elite of the elite, the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, known simply as the Team. The AATTV was a unique unit. It never numbered more than 100 men at any one time, yet it would become the most highly decorated unit in Australian military history, earning 4 Victoria Crosses. The men of the team were advisors. They didn't operate in the safety of large Australian formations. They were sent out in pairs, sometimes singly, to live in remote outposts and command companies of indigenous troops, the South Vietnamese Army, or ARVN, and the Civil Irregular Defense Group, or CIDG. Wheatley was sent to 1st Corps, the northernmost tactical zone in South Vietnam, to an outpost in the Tra Bong Valley in Quang Ngai Province. It was a Viet Cong stronghold. The terrain was a nightmare of steep, jungle-covered mountains falling into flat, muddy rice paddies. The elephant grass in the valley grew 7 feet tall, sharp enough to slice skin and thick enough to hide an entire battalion. At Tra Bong, Wheatley faced the advisor's dilemma. He was technically in command of a company of CIDG soldiers, local Montagnard tribesmen, and Vietnamese irregulars. These men were brave, but they were often poorly equipped, poorly paid, and terrified of the Viet Cong Main Force units that dominated the valley. The dilemma was simple. When the shooting started, would they fight or would they run? If they ran, the Australian advisor would be left alone, miles from support, with nothing but his rifle and his radio. Wheatley handled the pressure in a way that confused people who only saw the rough exterior. The brick burner with the heavy hands had a soft spot that bordered on obsession. He loved children. In the poverty of Quang Ngai province, the village children were often sick, hungry, and terrified. Wheatley began writing home to his wife, Fay, asking for packages, not for beer or cigarettes, but for sweets and stuffed toys. When Wheatley went on patrol, loading his webbing with ammunition, grenades, and water, he would also stuff his pockets with candy and small dolls. He became a familiar sight in the villages of Tra Bong, this stocky, sweating Australian lifting tiny Vietnamese children onto his shoulders, handing out toys in the middle of a war zone. It wasn't a tactic to win hearts and minds. It was just who he was. He was a man who would brawl in a bar on Friday and carry a sick child to a medic on Saturday. But the softness ended the moment he stepped outside the wire. It didn't take long for the Viet Cong and Quang Ngai to learn who Dasher Wheatley was. 2 months after arriving, on May 28, 1965, Wheatley was on patrol east of Tra Bong. The heat was suffocating, the humidity trapped by the dense canopy. The patrol was moving through a village when the air exploded. They had walked into a contact. Automatic weapons fire erupted from the tree line, tearing into the thatch huts and kicking up geysers of dirt in the street. The CIDG troops, reacting to the ambush, dove for cover behind dikes and trees, returning fire wildly. The noise was deafening, the distinct crack thump of enemy AK-47s mixing with the sharper reports of the advisors' carbines. In the middle of the kill zone, frozen by the noise, was a 3-year-old Vietnamese girl. She was standing directly in the line of fire. The air around her was snapping with supersonic rounds. The indigenous troops stayed down. The tactical reality was clear. To move into that street was suicide. Wheatley didn't check with his counterpart. He didn't signal for cover fire. He just moved. With that surging, piston-like gait, Wheatley broke cover and sprinted into the open. He ran directly through the crossfire, the rounds kicking up dust around his boots. He reached the girl, and instead of grabbing her and running, he threw his body over hers. He used his own back as a shield, curling around the child while the machine gun fire chewed up the ground inches from him. He waited for a lull in the burst, then scooped her up and sprinted back to safety. It was an act of pure instinct. Later, the United States military would recommend him for the Silver Star, citing his utter disregard for his own safety. But for Wheatley, it established a pattern. He didn't calculate odds. When someone was in trouble, he went to them. By August, the war in our Corps was changing. The Viet Cong were no longer just guerrillas taking potshots. They were organizing into battalion-sized units, digging in and standing their ground. On August 18, 1965, during an operation at Ba Tuong, Wheatley's company was tasked with assaulting a Viet Cong position on a steep, fortified hill. The enemy was dug in deep. As the CIDG troops began to climb the slope, the VC opened up. The volume of fire was intense. The lead elements of the assault faltered. The indigenous soldiers stopped climbing, pressing themselves into the mud, unwilling to advance into the teeth of the guns. The assault was stalling. If they stayed there, they would be picked apart by mortars. Wheatley realized that shouting orders wasn't working. He switched to the only language that translates perfectly in combat: shame. He stood up. While his soldiers were hugging the dirt, Wheatley began climbing the hill alone. He yelled at them, waved his rifle, and charged the enemy bunkers by himself. It was a display of aggression that bordered on madness. Seeing their advisor charging alone, the CIDG troops realized they would lose more face by staying down than they would lose blood by standing up. They rallied. The company surged up the hill behind Wheatley and overran the position. During the consolidation, Wheatley found a South Vietnamese soldier who had been badly wounded in the initial volley. The man couldn't walk. The position was still taking sporadic fire. Wheatley slung the soldier over his shoulder, carrying the man's full weight plus his own gear, and carried him down the steep slope to the medevac point. Warrant Officer Class 2, Jack Peckover, another member of the team who served in I Corps, described Wheatley's style simply. He said, "Dasher was the sort of bloke who would fight a buzzsaw." It wasn't just bravery. It was a specific kind of Australian aggression, a refusal to take a backward step. But Wheatley wasn't invincible. The jungle didn't care about his reputation. In late 1965, intelligence reports began to filter into the Tra Bong camp. They weren't just facing local Viet Cong anymore. North Vietnamese Army regulars, the NVA, were moving down the Ho Chi Minh Trail and filtering into Quang Ngai. These were professional soldiers, uniformed, equipped with Chinese AK-47s and RPD machine guns, and trained in unit maneuver. They were hunting the advisors. Wheatley knew the stakes were rising. He continued to patrol with his pockets full of sweets for the kids, but his eyes were on the ridgelines. He was partnered with a junior advisor, Warrant Officer Class II Ronald Butch Swanton. Swanton was a good soldier, but in the hierarchy of the team, Wheatley was the senior man. In the unwritten code of the Australian Army, that meant Wheatley was responsible for him. And in November, in the rice paddies of the Tra Bong Valley, that responsibility would be tested to its absolute limit. November 13, 1965. The Tra Bong Valley. It was mid-afternoon, and the heat was heavy, the kind that presses against your chest like a physical weight. The monsoon season was approaching, and the rice paddies were thick with mud, the water level rising. Wheatley and Swanton were on a search and destroy patrol codenamed Operation Hump. The operation had been grinding on for days. The objective was to flush out a Viet Cong Main Force battalion that intelligence said was operating in the area. The company was moving in a column, sweeping through the valley floor, bordered by steep, jungle-covered ridges. The company split into 3 platoons to cover more ground. Wheatley and Warrant Officer Ronald Butch Swanton were with the rear element, moving through the open paddies while the lead elements pushed into the tree line. The separation between the groups widened. In the dense terrain of I-Corps, losing visual contact with your flank security takes only seconds. At approximately 13:30 hours, the trap snapped shut. It wasn't a skirmish. It was a well-coordinated, company-sized ambush initiated by the Viet Cong Main Force. They had waited in the tree line, watching the lead elements pass, letting them get just far enough away to be unable to support the rear. Then, they opened up on Wheatley and Swanton's isolated group. The air around them disintegrated. Heavy machine gun fire raked the paddy from the tree line, churning the water into a frothy spray. Mortar rounds began to walk across the open ground, blowing columns of black mud and water 50 feet into the air. The indigenous troops, the CIDG, reacted exactly as the advisors feared they might. Under the overwhelming volume of fire, their discipline shattered. They broke contact and ran. They didn't retreat in a bounding overwatch. They fled, sprinting for the safety of the jungle, leaving the 2 Australians exposed in the kill zone. Wheatley and Swanton were now alone. 2 men against a reinforced company of nearly 100 enemy soldiers. In the first seconds of the ambush, Warrant Officer Swanton was hit. A burst of automatic fire caught him in the upper chest. The impact of high-velocity rounds at close range is devastating. It didn't just wound him, it smashed him backward into the mud. He collapsed, gasping for air, blood pouring from a sucking chest wound. Wheatley was unhurt. The CIDG troops were already disappearing into the distance. The tactical manual for an advisor in this situation is clear. If the indigenous force routes, you break contact, you escape and evade. You live to rebuild the unit. Staying in the kill zone of a company-sized ambush is suicide. But Dasher Wheatley didn't read the manual. He saw Swanton go down. Wheatley keyed his radio, calling for immediate air support and medical evacuation. Then, ignoring the rounds snapping past his head, he ran to Swanton. He dropped to his knees in the mud, grabbed the heavier man by the webbing, and began to drag him. The enemy fire intensified. The Viet Cong could see they had 2 isolated targets. They began to maneuver, flanking the position to cut off any escape route. Wheatley had to move Swanton to cover, but in a rice paddy, cover is a relative term. The only protection was a wooded area about 200 meters away. 200 meters is a short sprint on a track. In knee-deep mud, dragging a 200-pound man while taking effective fire, it is an eternity. Wheatley half-carried, half-dragged Swanton through the mire. Every time the enemy fire peaked, Wheatley would drop, shielding Swanton with his own body, returning fire with his rifle. Then he would get up, grab the webbing, and heave again. He did this for 200 meters, muscles burning, lungs screaming for oxygen, mud sucking at his boots with every step. He got Swanton to the edge of the wood line. It wasn't safe, but it offered concealment. Swanton was deteriorating rapidly. He was pale, losing blood fast, barely conscious. Wheatley checked him, applying a field dressing, but he knew it wasn't enough. Swanton needed a surgeon, and he needed one 10 minutes ago. Then, the sound of salvation. The heavy, rhythmic thud, thud, thud of a radial engine. A United States Marine Corps UH-34 Seahorse helicopter, piloted by Captain Arthur Feller, dropped out of the sky. The UH-34 was a workhorse, a big piston-engine chopper with a high profile, a massive target. Captain Feller saw the purple smoke Wheatley had popped and dove toward it. The landing zone was hot. The Viet Cong concentrated everything they had on the descending aircraft. Rounds punched through the fuselage. The sound inside the cockpit was a deafening mix of engine roar and the metallic clack of bullets striking aluminum. Feller couldn't land. The terrain was too rough, the mud too deep. He brought the bird to a hover just a few feet off the ground, the rotor wash flattening the elephant grass, whipping the water into a frenzy. This was the moment. The window for extraction was measured in seconds. Wheatley grabbed Swanton again. He tried to lift him up to the helicopter door, but the physics were impossible. Swanton was dead weight. The mud was slippery. The helicopter was vibrating violently in the hover. Wheatley heaved, straining every fiber of muscle he had built in the brickyards of Surrey Hills, but he couldn't get Swanton high enough. Swanton, in a moment of clarity, reportedly told Wheatley to leave him, to save himself. Captain Feller was screaming from the cockpit, gesturing frantically for Wheatley to jump. The aircraft was taking heavy damage. If they stayed any longer, the chopper would be shot down, and everyone would die. Wheatley looked at the open door of the helicopter. He looked at the pilot. He looked at the jungle where the enemy was closing in, and then he looked down at his mate. It was a calculation that defies military logic but defines human loyalty. If Wheatley got on that chopper, he would survive. He would go home to Faye. He would see his children grow up. But Ronald Swanton would die alone in the mud, surrounded by the enemy. Wheatley made his choice. He looked up at Captain Feller and shook his head. He waved the helicopter away. According to the after-action reports and the testimony of the aircrew, Wheatley's final words to the radio operator were clear. "I'm not leaving him. Get out of here." Captain Feller hesitated. No pilot wants to leave a man behind, but the enemy fire was now hammering the aircraft. Warning lights were flashing. The choice was taken out of his hands. He pulled pitch, and the UH-34 climbed away, banking hard to escape the kill zone. As the helicopter lifted, the crew looked back. They saw Dasher Wheatley standing over Swanton. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He had pulled the pins on 2 grenades, holding one in each hand. He stood there, waiting for the Viet Cong to assault their position. The helicopter disappeared over the tree line. For a moment, there was just the sound of the fading engine. Then, the men in the air and the ground units pushing toward the location heard 2 distinct explosions. Crump, crump, the grenades. Seconds later, a burst of small arms fire erupted from the wood line, and then, silence. The silence in the Tra Bong Valley was heavy. The lead Australian elements, furious and frantic, fought their way back to the ambush site, but it was too late. The enemy had melted away into the jungle. When they found the bodies the next morning, the story of the final stand was written in the dirt. Wheatley and Swanton were lying side by side. Wheatley was found with his grenades gone. Both men had died from gunshot wounds. There was something unusual about the scene. In the Vietnam War, it was not uncommon for the Viet Cong to mutilate the bodies of enemy soldiers, especially advisors who had caused them trouble. It was a psychological tactic. But Wheatley and Swanton were untouched. Intelligence reports later suggested that the Viet Cong commander had forbidden his men from touching the bodies. They knew what Wheatley had done. They had watched the helicopter leave. They had seen the man stand his ground with grenades in his hands. Even the enemy, in the brutality of an ideological war, recognized the universal language of courage. They left them with their dignity, but if the enemy respected them, the bureaucracy of their own government failed them. In 1965, the Australian government had a policy regarding the repatriation of war dead that seems incomprehensible today. If a soldier was killed in Vietnam, the government would not pay to bring the body home unless the family could afford the enormous cost. If they couldn't pay, the soldier was buried in the nearest Commonwealth War Cemetery. For Wheatley and Swanton, that meant the Tarandak Garrison Cemetery in Malaysia. They had died for Australia, but they were left in foreign soil because of a budget line item. It was a final insult to the families who had already lost everything. The military, however, knew exactly what Wheatley had done. The recommendation for the Victoria Cross, the highest award for gallantry in the British Commonwealth, equivalent to the American Medal of Honor, went up the chain of command immediately. The citation, published in the London Gazette on December 13, 1966, was unequivocal. It read, "Warrant Officer Wheatley refused to abandon his wounded comrade. His acts of heroism, determination, and unflinching loyalty in the face of the enemy were of the highest order and in the finest traditions of the Australian Army." It was the first Victoria Cross awarded to an Australian in the Vietnam War. It set the standard for what the AATTV stood for, but a medal couldn't bring Dasher back to Faye. Faye Wheatley became the keeper of his memory. She famously said of her husband, "He was a rough diamond, but he was my diamond." She raised their children alone, telling them stories of the brick burner who carried toys in his pockets. For decades, the families of the Vietnam dead fought a different kind of war. They fought the Bring Them Home campaign, a lobbying effort to force the Australian government to change its policy and repatriate the remains of the men left in Malaysia and Singapore. It took 50 years. Finally, in May 2016, the Australian government announced that 33 Australians buried overseas, including Wheatley and Swanton, would be brought home. On June 2, 2016, 2 Royal Australian Air Force C-17 Globemasters touched down at RAAF Base Richmond, just outside Sydney. The ramp lowered. The coffins, draped in the Australian flag, were carried out by bearers from the current 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, Wheatley's old unit. It was a moment of profound national healing. Dasher Wheatley, the man who refused to leave his mate, had finally been refused by his nation to be left behind. He was reinterred in Pine Grove Memorial Park in New South Wales, finally at rest in the country he died representing. His legacy, however, is not in the grave. It is in the doctrine of the Australian Army. Every recruit who passes through Kapooka or Duntroon hears the story of Wheatley and Swanton. They are taught that while tactics change and weapons evolve, the core value of the Australian soldier remains static. You look after your mate. Lieutenant Colonel Ted Sarong, the legendary first commander of the AATTV, summed it up best when he wrote about Wheatley's decision. He said, "The outcome was inevitable. He chose to die rather than leave his comrade to a certain and lonely death." If you go back to that moment in the rice paddy, to the second before the helicopter pulled away, you see the entire story of the war condensed into a single gesture. There is the noise, the mud, the terrifying geometry of the ambush. There is the technology, the American helicopter, the radio, the air support, all of it rendered useless by the simple fact that a human body is heavy and hard to move. And then there is the wave, the hand signaling the pilot to go. It is the most counterintuitive action a human being can take. Every biological imperative screams at you to survive. Every instinct says to jump in the helicopter, but Kevin Dasher Wheatley didn't listen to instinct. He listened to a code that was written in the brickyards of Surrey Hills and hardened in the jungles of Malaya. Bravery is often described as the act of killing the enemy or taking the objective. But in the Tra Bong Valley, on a muddy afternoon in November 1965, bravery was something quieter. It was simply the refusal to walk away. Dasher Wheatley knew he was dead the moment he let that helicopter leave. He accepted it. He just didn't want his mate to die alone.